April 11th, 1945. Nordhausen, Germany. The spring air carries the acrid smell of smoke and decay as elements of the United States 3rd Armored Division and the 104th Infantry Division roll into a town that has been reduced to rubble by recent Allied bombing raids. Captain John Anderson of the 104th Infantry pushes through the shattered streets toward a former Luftwaffe barracks on the edge of town. What he discovers there will haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the Bulka Kaserne, hundreds of emaciated prisoners lie scattered across the floor, many already dead, others barely clinging to life. The stench is overwhelming. Bodies pile in corners where they fell, victims of starvation, disease, and the brutal forced labor that brought them here. Anderson, a veteran of campaigns across France and Belgium, has seen combat carnage before, but this is different. This is something else entirely. As medics rush forward to help the survivors, other American troops begin exploring the area around Nordhausen. 2 kilometers southwest of town, near the village of Niedersachswerfen, they discover something that defies imagination. Carved into Kohnstein Mountain are 2 massive tunnel entrances, each large enough to drive a truck through. The camouflage has been hastily removed. Inside, electric lights still burn. Ventilation systems still hum. And stretching into the darkness of the mountain are rows upon rows of partially assembled V-2 rockets, the terror weapons that had rained down on London and Antwerp just months before. The Americans have stumbled upon Mittelwerk, the Third Reich's most sophisticated underground weapons factory, a subterranean manufacturing complex that represents both the pinnacle of German wartime engineering and the depths of human cruelty. To understand how this underground world came to exist, we must step back to the summer of 1943, when the tide of World War II was turning decisively against Nazi Germany. On the night of August 17, 696 Royal Air Force bombers took off from bases across England, their destination a small island on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. British intelligence had identified the location as the primary research and development center for Germany's secret vengeance weapons, the V-1 flying bomb in the V-2 ballistic missile. The raid was devastating. More than 1,800 tons of bombs fell on Peenemünde in 40 minutes, killing hundreds of workers and scientists, destroying critical facilities, and setting back the German rocket program by months. For Hitler and his armaments minister Albert Speer, the message was clear. Germany's advanced weapons programs could no longer survive above ground. The relentless Allied bombing campaign that was reducing German cities to ash would find and destroy any conventional factory, no matter how well defended. The only solution was to go underground, to burrow deep into the earth where Allied bombers could not reach. Within days of the Peenemünde raid, the decision was made to convert an existing underground facility near Nordhausen into a massive V-2 production plant. The site had originally been excavated in the 1930s as a storage depot for fuel and chemical weapons, 2 parallel tunnels driven straight through Kohnstein Mountain, connected by dozens of cross galleries. Now it would become something far more sinister. The project was codenamed Mittelwerk, meaning Central Works, a deliberately vague designation that revealed nothing about its true purpose. To construct and operate this underground factory, the SS established a new concentration camp at Dora, later renamed Mittelbau Dora, on the northern slope of the Kohnstein. At the end of August 1943, the first work commandos arrived from Buchenwald concentration camp, transported in cattle cars to begin the hellish task of converting storage tunnels into a modern assembly line. The initial phase of construction represented a descent into barbarism that shocked even hardened SS officers. Thousands of prisoners lived and worked inside the mountain itself, never seeing daylight for weeks or months at a time. They slept in the cross galleries on crude wooden bunks, stacked 4 high, often sharing space with the dead until bodies could be removed. There were no sanitary facilities in the early months. Men relieved themselves where they worked. The air was thick with rock dust from constant drilling and blasting operations. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts, using pickaxes and pneumatic drills to expand the tunnels, constructing massive underground halls up to 12 meters high. Many labored on scaffolding 30 feet above the tunnel floors, weakened by starvation and disease. When they became too exhausted to hold on, they simply fell to their deaths on the rock below. Their bodies were loaded onto trucks and transported to the crematorium at Buchenwald, Every other day, these trucks made their grim journey, sometimes carrying as many as 100 corpses. In December 1943, a typhus epidemic swept through the underground workforce, further decimating already depleted ranks. The death toll accelerated. Production demands did not decrease. The SS simply ordered more prisoners from other camps to replace those who died. By January 1944, the prisoner population at Dora had swollen to 12,000. By February 1945, it reached 19,000. Most were political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, French resistance fighters, and Jews from across occupied Europe. They came from Hungary, Poland, Greece, France, Belgium, the Netherlands. They spoke different languages but shared a common fate, condemned to work in darkness, building weapons that would kill civilians in distant cities they would never see. The engineering challenge of Mittelwerk was formidable even without considering the human cost. The V-2 rocket was the most sophisticated weapon system of its time, a 46-foot-long ballistic missile weighing nearly 13 tons at launch, capable of traveling at speeds exceeding 3,500 miles per hour and reaching targets 200 miles away. Each rocket contained approximately 30,000 individual parts that had to be manufactured, transported, and assembled with precision. Creating an assembly line for such a complex weapon inside a mountain, using slave labor in the midst of total war, was an unprecedented undertaking. The two main tunnels, designated Tunnel A and Tunnel B, ran parallel through the mountain for approximately 1.25 miles each. 46 cross galleries connected them at regular intervals, creating a grid system that allowed for efficient movement of materials and personnel. Tunnel A became the primary assembly area. Specialized workshops were established in various cross galleries. Gallery 20 handled electrical systems. Gallery 30 specialized in gyroscopic equipment. Gallery 41 focused on rocket engines. Tunnel B served multiple functions. Its southern section manufactured the V-unflying bomb, a simpler weapon that could be produced more quickly. Other areas housed machinery shops, quality control stations, and storage for components shipped in from suppliers across Germany. Narrow-gauge railway tracks ran through both main tunnels, allowing small locomotives to transport heavy components and completed missiles. The entire complex was climate-controlled, with sophisticated ventilation systems maintaining breathable air throughout. Electric lighting illuminated work areas. The Germans had created an underground city dedicated to a single purpose: the mass production of vengeance weapons. By the summer of 1944, the assembly line was fully operational. German civilian technicians worked alongside SS guards to supervise the forced labor. Engineers from Peenemünde, including Werner von Braun, the technical director of the V-2 program, made regular visits to oversee quality control and resolve production problems. Von Braun later admitted to visiting Mittelwerk 10 to 15 times, including an extended stay during the nightmarish construction period in the fall of 1943, when prisoners were dying by the hundreds. The production statistics tell their own story. Between August 1944 and March 1945, approximately 6,000 V-2 rockets rolled off the Mittelwerk assembly line. At peak production in early 1945, workers completed more than 600 missiles per month. These weapons would go on to kill more than 5,000 Allied civilians and military personnel, primarily in London and Antwerp. But the rockets claim far more victims in their creation than in their use. Modern historians estimate that between 20,000 and 25,000 prisoners died in the Mittelbau-Dora camp system out of 60,000 who passed through its gates. At least 10,000 of those deaths can be directly attributed to the V-2 program at Mittelwerk. The rocket became a unique weapon in the annals of warfare. Twice as many people died producing it as were killed by it. While Mittelwerk represented the most successful of Germany's underground weapons programs, it was far from the only one. Across the Reich, wherever mountains provided suitable geology, the Nazis burrowed into the earth, creating networks of tunnels and caverns for military purposes. In Lower Silesia, in what is now southwestern Poland, a vast construction project known as Ries, meaning giant, sprawled across the Owl Mountains near Książ Castle. Construction began in 1943 under Hitler's direct orders, though the project's ultimate purpose remains debated to this day. The official explanation claimed Ries would serve as an underground headquarters for Hitler himself. a secure command center from which he could direct operations even as Allied armies closed in from all sides. Other theories suggested the tunnels would house relocated armaments factories, similar to Mittelwerk, but on an even grander scale. Some reports indicated that more than 35 square kilometers of underground facilities were planned, though only a fraction was completed before Germany's collapse. What is certain is the staggering scale of the undertaking. 7 major tunnel systems were excavated at different sites throughout the Owl Mountains, with code names like Osovka, Włodarz, Rzeczka, and Jugowice. The largest, Włodarz, contains approximately 3 kilometers of tunnels, with massive chambers carved from solid gneiss rock. Unlike the softer sandstone found at other sites, gneiss is extraordinarily hard, which slowed construction considerably, but provided total protection from even the heaviest Allied bombs. The Germans could build underground halls 12 meters high with spans of 6,000 cubic meters, spaces large enough to house entire factories or command complexes. Construction of Ries consumed enormous resources. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later wrote that more concrete was used for Ries alone than was allocated in 1944 for the entire German civilian population to construct air raid shelters. An estimated 257,000 cubic meters of reinforced concrete went into creating 213,000 cubic meters of tunnels, a ratio suggesting massive structural reinforcement throughout. The human cost matched the material investment. Nearly 30,000 prisoners from concentration camps across German-occupied territory were deployed to Ries, working in conditions as brutal as those at Mittelwerk. They came primarily from the Gross-Rosen concentration camp system. Mortality rates were staggering. Exact figures remain uncertain because records were destroyed, but historians believe several thousand prisoners died during construction, many of them in the spring of 1945, when the SS executed workers to prevent them from revealing what they had built. One section of tunnels at Włodarz is permanently flooded, and local researchers believe hundreds or thousands of bodies may remain entombed there, sealed forever when the SS demolished tunnel entrances in the final days of the war. In Austria, another massive underground complex took shape beneath the town of St. Jorgen an der Gusen, part of the Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp system. Codenamed Bergkristall, or Mountain Crystal, this facility was designed to manufacture the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft. Construction began in January 1944, with 272 prisoners transferred from Mauthausen. By November, 20,000 of the 40,000 forced laborers employed at Bergkristall had perished from the brutal working conditions. The complex eventually comprised approximately 40,000 square meters of underground space carved from solid rock, with 8.5 kilometers of tunnels creating an intricate network of galleries and halls. Like Mittelwerk, Bergkristall achieved operational status despite the horrific construction process. By late 1944, assembly of Me-262 fuselages had begun, continuing through April 1945. According to Allied intelligence reports compiled after the war, some 987 jet-propelled aircraft left the serial production lines at Bergkristall before operations ceased with Germany's collapse. These underground projects represented more than military desperation. They embodied a fundamental characteristic of the Nazi regime, the willingness to expend unlimited human suffering in pursuit of technological superiority. The concentration camp system and advanced weapons development had become intertwined. SS General Hans Kammler, who had previously supervised construction of the gas chambers at Auschwitz, was appointed to oversee not only Mittelwerk, but an entire network of underground construction projects across Greater Germany. Kammler brought to this assignment the same disregard for human life that had characterized his earlier work. Prisoners were viewed as expendable resources, to be worked to death and replaced from the seemingly inexhaustible supply of concentration camp inmates. When the fighter staff, an emergency program to ramp up fighter aircraft production, required additional underground factories, Kammler created numerous subcamps around Nordhausen and elsewhere, tunneling out new facilities with complete indifference to the death toll. Even as conditions improved slightly in the main Mittelbau-Dora camp by 1945, horrifying conditions prevailed at these satellite camps devoted to new construction. Several thousand prisoners died in these tunneling operations alone. The strategic logic behind going underground was sound from a purely military perspective. Allied bombers could obliterate any surface facility, but they had no weapon capable of penetrating deep into solid rock. Mittelwerk, buried under hundreds of feet of mountain, was essentially invulnerable to air attack. The RAF bombed Nordhausen twice in early April 1945, but they were targeting what they believed were barracks and supply depots in the town itself, not the underground factory. The raids killed hundreds of prisoners and destroyed much of Nordhausen, but they barely scratched Mittelwerk. The tunnels protected more than production facilities. They also safeguarded Germany's scientific and technical personnel, keeping them working when surface factories lay in ruins. This was particularly important for cutting-edge technologies like rockets and jet aircraft, where specialized knowledge was as valuable as the hardware being produced. But the underground strategy had fatal weaknesses. Moving major industrial operations below ground was extraordinarily time-consuming. Reese never came close to completion. Of the estimated 2 million cubic meters of rock that needed to be excavated, only about half was removed before the war ended. The project consumed vast quantities of concrete, steel, and labor that might have been more effectively employed elsewhere. Even Mittelwerk, the most successful underground facility, took months to reach full production capacity, months during which the military situation deteriorated beyond recovery. By April 1945, the Reich was in its death throes. Soviet armies were hammering through the suburbs of Berlin. American and British forces were advancing rapidly from the west. The underground factories could produce weapons, but Germany no longer had the fuel, the pilots, the launchers, or the strategic depth to employ them effectively. The V-2 rockets rolling off Mittelwerk's assembly line in March 1945 were magnificent achievements of engineering and utterly meaningless to the war's outcome. It was into this collapsing nightmare that American troops stumbled on April 11th. The unit that first reached Nordhausen was part of the American advance that had accelerated dramatically in recent weeks. Germany was disintegrating. Resistance had become sporadic and disorganized. Towns that might have fought to the last man just months earlier now surrendered without firing a shot. But nothing had prepared the Americans for what they found at Nordhausen. The Belka Kaserne contained evidence of atrocities on a scale most soldiers had never imagined. The sick and dying prisoners told horrific stories through interpreters, tales of starvation, beatings, executions, and slave labor in tunnels under the mountain. Medics and doctors worked frantically to save those who could be saved, but many were beyond help. Their bodies had been so ravaged by malnutrition and disease that liberation came too late. As word spread of the discoveries at Nordhausen, army photographers and film crews arrived to document the scene. The resulting footage would be shown to American audiences, brief glimpses of Nazi crimes that would shock a nation. But the full extent of what had happened there would take years to uncover. While medics worked at the barracks, combat engineers and intelligence officers made their way to the tunnel entrances in Konstein Mountain. What they found inside exceeded anything in their briefing materials. The scale of Mittelwerk was staggering. Tunnel A stretched before them, brilliantly lit, with completed V-2 rockets standing upright on transport dollies at regular intervals. The assembly line was intact, frozen in place as if workers had simply stepped out for lunch. Tools lay where they had been set down. Components awaited installation. The entire facility was still powered, still ventilated, still functional. Work had stopped on April 10th, just one day before the Americans arrived. The SS guards and German civilian personnel had fled as American forces approached, but they had not destroyed the facility. Perhaps they ran out of time. Perhaps they believed the Soviets, not the Americans, would be the ones to find it, since Nordhausen lay in what had been designated as the Soviet occupation zone. Whatever the reason, Mittelwerk fell into American hands essentially intact, the most complete capture of advanced German military technology of the entire war. For the intelligence officers present, the implications were immediately clear. The United States was now in possession of the most sophisticated rocket program on Earth. Every secret of the V-2, every manufacturing process, every technical document lay waiting to be exploited. But there was a problem, one that would spark a frantic race against the clock. Under the agreements reached by the Allied powers, this entire region would be handed over to Soviet control on July 1st, less than 3 months away. Everything in Nordhausen, every rocket, every blueprint, every piece of equipment would become Soviet property unless it could be removed before that deadline. The order came down from the highest levels of the American command structure: strip Mittelwerk. Take everything that could be moved. Leave nothing of value for the Russians. Special Mission 5-2 was hastily organized under Major William Bromley to coordinate the massive operation. The task was monumental. Each V-2 rocket weighed 13 tons. There were 100 complete or nearly complete missiles in the tunnels, plus countless components, sub-assemblies, in specialized manufacturing equipment. All of it needed to be cataloged, disassembled where necessary, loaded onto rail cars, and transported west before the July deadline. Major James P. Hamill took charge of the actual logistics, working with the 144th Motor Vehicle Assembly Company to move the hardware. Rail lines had been damaged by Allied bombing, complicating the effort. Routes had to be planned carefully to avoid areas already under Soviet control. Security was a constant concern. German civilians and former workers who knew the value of what was being removed. The first trainload of V-2 components departed Nordhausen on May 22nd, barely 6 weeks after the initial discovery. Over the following weeks, more than 341 railroad cars rolled westward, carrying enough material to manufacture 100 V-2 missiles, along with vast quantities of manufacturing equipment, test equipment, and technical documentation. The Germans had been meticulous record keepers, and much of their paperwork had survived. These documents, covering everything from chemical propellant formulas to guidance system specifications, would prove as valuable as the hardware itself. But Special Mission V-2 was not focused solely on rockets and equipment. There was another prize even more valuable: the scientists and engineers who had designed and built these weapons. Another operation already underway, even before Nordhausen fell, would bring many of these men to the United States. Operation Paperclip, initially codenamed Operation Overcast, had been formally established by the Joint Chiefs of Staff on July 20th, 1944, with the dual aims of exploiting German scientific expertise and preventing it from falling into Soviet hands. The program was run by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, staffed by representatives from Army Intelligence, Naval Intelligence, Air Force Intelligence, and the State Department. Their mission was straightforward in concept, but enormously complex in execution: identify Germany's most valuable scientists and engineers, locate them as Germany collapsed, bring them to America. A parallel effort focused specifically on nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project had been developed in an atmosphere of intense fear that Germany might achieve an atomic bomb first. German physicists had discovered nuclear fission in 1938. They had access to some of the world's best scientists and the resources of an entire nation mobilized for total war. By 1944, American intelligence was desperate to know how close Germany was to a working atomic weapon. The Alsos mission was created to answer that question. Named ironically for its commander, General Leslie Groves, also being Greek for Groves, though Groves himself was reportedly furious when he learned of the breach in security, the mission combined scientists and military personnel in teams that would follow Allied combat forces into enemy territory. Colonel Boris Pash, a former Manhattan Project security officer who had uncovered a Soviet spy ring trying to steal American nuclear secrets, led the military side. Samuel Goudsmit, a Dutch-American physicist, served as chief scientific advisor. Their job was to find German nuclear facilities, capture German nuclear scientists, and assess the threat of a German atomic bomb. The Alsos teams first deployed to Italy in 1943, then followed the Allied advance through France. In November 1944, they reached Strasbourg and made a discovery that changed everything. Documents captured at the university there revealed the true state of the German nuclear program. It was far behind the American effort, still in the experimental phase, nowhere near producing a weapon. For the first time, Goudsmit could report with confidence that a German atomic bomb was not going to threaten Allied victory. The fear that had driven much of the Manhattan Project's urgency was unfounded, but the mission continued. If Germany did not have an atomic bomb, the United States wanted to know why. What had they attempted? What had gone wrong? And most critically, in the emerging geopolitical landscape, could their scientists and research be kept out of Soviet hands? As Allied armies drove deeper into Germany in April 1945, ALSO's teams fanned out across the country. At Stadtulm, they discovered documentation on the German nuclear program, components of an experimental nuclear reactor, and 8 tons of uranium oxide. Scientists captured at Göttingen included Werner Osenberg, chief of the planning board of the Reich Research Council. At Celle, they found an experimental centrifuge for separating uranium isotopes. The most dramatic operation came in late April with Operation Big, an audacious raid across enemy lines into the town of Hechingen in southwestern Germany. This area was designated for French occupation and would eventually fall under French control, but American intelligence had determined that it harbored some of Germany's most important atomic scientists. Colonel Pasch led a small force of 2 armored cars and 4 machine gun-equipped jeeps across German lines and into Hechingen on April 24th. They captured a major atomic physics laboratory and took into custody several key scientists, including Otto Hahn, the discoverer of nuclear fission, Max von Laue, and Carl von Weizsäcker. Interrogations revealed that Werner Heisenberg, the scientific head of the German nuclear program, had left Hechingen 2 weeks earlier and fled to Bavaria. Pasch learned that critical research documents had been sealed in a metal drum and hidden in a cesspool behind von Weizsäcker's house. Recovery teams were dispatched to retrieve the documents, literally fishing German atomic secrets out of human waste. The drum was found, the papers inside were intact, and the United States gained access to years of German nuclear research. Meanwhile, other ALSO's teams were hunting for Heisenberg himself. He was located in the village of Urfeld in the Bavarian Alps, living with his family in a house overlooking a lake. On May 1st, American forces reached Urfeld. Heisenberg, who had spent years at the forefront of German physics and had led the Reich's attempts to develop nuclear weapons, was taken into custody without resistance. By early June, 10 of Germany's leading nuclear scientists had been captured. They were transported to England and detained at Farm Hall, a bugged mansion near Cambridge, as part of Operation Epsilon. British intelligence wanted to listen to their private conversations, to understand what they had attempted, why they had failed, and what they truly believed about working for the Nazi regime. The transcripts of their conversations over the following months would become some of the most revealing documents of the German wartime scientific effort. The scientists expressed shock when they learned of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th. Some initially doubted the report was genuine. Otto Hahn, who felt personally responsible that his discovery of fission had led to such destruction, was devastated. The conversations revealed that the German scientists had fundamentally miscalculated the amount of enriched uranium needed for a weapon, overestimating it by a factor of hundreds or thousands. Whether this was genuine error or a form of passive resistance to building a bomb for Hitler remained debated for decades afterward. What was clear from the Farm Hall transcripts was that Germany had never come close to developing a working atomic weapon. While the ALSO's mission focused on nuclear secrets, Operation Paperclip cast a much wider net. The United States wanted Germany's rocket scientists, its jet aircraft designers, its aeronautical engineers, its chemical weapons experts, its radar specialists. Any field where German research had advanced beyond Allied capabilities became a target for exploitation. The problem was that many of these scientists had been active members of the Nazi Party. Some held ranks in the SS. Some had directly overseen slave labor operations that had killed thousands. President Truman's authorization of Operation Paperclip in August 1945 included explicit language that anyone found to have been more than a nominal member of the Nazi Party or an active supporter of Nazi militarism should be excluded from the program. But this proved to be a guideline easily circumvented. Werner von Braun, the most prized recruit of Operation Paperclip, had joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and accepted a commission in the SS, eventually reaching the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major. He had visited Mittelwerk repeatedly during the period when prisoners were dying en masse in the tunnels. He had personally selected concentration camp prisoners for technical work. Under Truman's stated criteria, von Braun should have been ineligible for Operation Paperclip, but he was the leading rocket scientist in the world, the technical director who had overseen development of the V-2 from concept to operational weapon. The United States wanted him. The Soviets wanted him. The choice was binary: deny him because of his Nazi connections and watch him fall into Soviet hands, or bring him to America despite his past. The decision was never really in doubt. Von Braun's dossier was sanitized, his Nazi Party membership downplayed, his SS rank explained away as honorary and forced upon him by Himmler. His visits to Mittelwerk were reframed as technical oversight rather than complicity in slave labor. By September 1945, he was on his way to the United States. Von Braun was accompanied by 126 other German rocket scientists and engineers captured in May. They became the core of America's post-war missile program, initially based at Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. The V-2 components shipped from Mittelwerk gave them the hardware they needed to begin testing immediately. The first American-launched RFI-2 lifted off from White Sands on April 16, 1946, less than a year after Nordhausen fell. Over the following years, dozens more captured Valkyrie 2s would be launched, providing invaluable data on high-altitude flight, guidance systems, and rocket propulsion. But the American exploitation of German underground installations extended beyond Mittelwerk and the rocket program. As occupation forces spread across Germany in the summer of 1945, teams of investigators began cataloging the full scope of Nazi underground construction. The Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, a joint British-American organization, produced detailed reports on what they found. The documents described an archipelago of subterranean facilities scattered across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories. Some were completed and operational, like Mittelwerk. Others remained partially finished, construction halted by Germany's collapse. In Austria, near St. Georgen, an der Gusen, the Bergkristall complex was investigated by American troops before being handed over to Soviet control in August 1945. The Soviets would later destroy key parts of the tunnel system in 1947, but not before removing whatever equipment and documentation they deemed valuable. The Project Reese installations in Lower Silesia fell into Soviet hands as the Red Army swept through the region. Polish and Soviet authorities sealed most of the tunnel entrances with explosives or concrete. Exactly what the Russians found inside, what they removed, and what they destroyed remains unclear to this day. Many tunnels remain flooded or inaccessible. The archives in Moscow hold records that have never been released. In subsequent decades, Project Reese would become the subject of intense speculation and treasure hunting. Rumors circulated that the tunnels contained hidden caches of Nazi gold, stolen art treasures, even the legendary Amber Room looted from the Catherine Palace in Russia. None of these claims have been substantiated, but the sealed tunnels continue to fuel conspiracy theories about secret weapons, hidden laboratories, and undiscovered chambers. The historical reality, documented in Allied intelligence reports and German records that survived, is dramatic enough without embellishment. The Nazis constructed hundreds of underground facilities across their territory, ranging from small ammunition and storage bunkers to vast complexes like Mittelwerk and Riesa. The largest and most sophisticated served a clear military purpose: protecting weapons production from Allied air raids. They represented a massive diversion of resources that Germany could ill afford. They required enormous quantities of concrete and steel. They consumed the labor of tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. They occupied the attention of German engineers and managers who might have been more productively employed elsewhere. And they failed to change the war's outcome. The weapons produced in these underground factories, the V-2 rockets from Mittelwerk, the Mi-2-62 jets from Bergkristall, arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the military balance. By the time production reached meaningful levels, Germany lacked the strategic depth to employ these weapons effectively. The V-2s that struck London and Antwerp in 1944 and early 1945 were terrifying, but they could not reverse the Allied advance. The Mi-2-62 jets were superior to any Allied fighter, but there was insufficient fuel to fly them, insufficient trained pilots to man them, and insufficient time to develop effective tactics. The human cost of building these underground complexes far exceeded their military value. At Mittelbau Dora alone, more than 20,000 prisoners died. Thousands more perished at Bergkristall, at Reese, at smaller facilities across the Reich. They were worked to death to produce weapons that ultimately contributed little to Germany's war effort, but would contribute enormously to the post-war military capabilities of the United States and Soviet Union. For the survivors of these camps, liberation brought its own challenges. Many were so weakened by malnutrition and disease that they died in the weeks after Allied forces arrived. Those who recovered faced long journeys home to find that their families, their communities, their entire way of life had been destroyed. Some former prisoners, particularly those with technical skills, found themselves caught between the American and Soviet intelligence services, both eager to debrief anyone who had worked in the underground facilities and might provide information about German weapons programs. The physical sites themselves evolved differently depending on which occupation zone they fell into. Nordhausen and Mittelwerk were in the Soviet zone. After the Americans stripped out everything they could before the July deadline, the Soviets moved in and took what remained. They attempted to demolish the tunnel entrances in 1948, but miscalculated the explosives needed and succeeded only in sealing the entrances rather than destroying the entire complex. The tunnels remained largely intact, flooded in sections, abandoned and forgotten for decades. It was not until 1970 that a small memorial exhibition was established in the former crematory building to remember the prisoners who had died there. The tunnels themselves were not open to the public until 1995. Today, visitors can walk through sections of Tunnel A and Tunnel B, seeing the same massive galleries where prisoners once assembled rockets under the lash of SS guards. Information boards explain the history. Artifacts recovered from the tunnels are displayed: tools, equipment, remnants of the V2 assembly line. The Mittelbau Dora Memorial serves as both a museum and a memorial, documenting both the technological achievement and the human tragedy. The project reached sites in Poland took longer to become accessible. Under communist rule, the tunnels were sealed and largely ignored. Some sections were used for mushroom cultivation or cold storage. It was not until the 1990s, after the fall of communism, that serious efforts began to open the sites to tourism and research. Today, several of the Reese tunnel systems can be visited, Osovka, Wodaj, and Zechka among them. Tours take visitors deep into the mountains, through chambers carved from solid rock, past evidence of construction that stopped abruptly in early 1945. The scale becomes apparent only when standing inside these spaces. Halls large enough to house cathedral naves, tunnels stretching hundreds of meters into darkness, ventilation shafts rising to the surface, all created by hand, by prisoners who knew they were expendable, who understood that their survival mattered less than the completion of their work. The Bergkristall complex in Austria proved more difficult to preserve. After the Soviets destroyed key sections in the late 1940s, Austrian authorities filled most of the remaining tunnels with concrete in the 1980s and 1990s. Only about 2 kilometers of the original 8.5 kilometers remain accessible. Occasional tours are organized by the Gusen Memorial Committee and local authorities, offering limited glimpses into this underground world. But much of what was built there is now sealed forever, entombed in concrete, a deliberate erasure of a dark chapter in history. The scientific and technical intelligence gathered from these sites proved enormously valuable to both the United States and the Soviet Union in the early Cold War period. The V2 technology captured at Mittelwerk became the foundation for both the American and Soviet ballistic missile programs. Von Braun and his team of German scientists would go on to develop the Redstone rocket, the Jupiter Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile, and ultimately the Saturn V that carried astronauts to the moon. Soviet engineers working with their own collection of captured V2 components and German scientists who had fallen into their hands developed the R-1 missile, a direct copy of the V2, followed by increasingly sophisticated designs that culminated in the R-7, the first intercontinental ballistic missile and the launcher that put Sputnik into orbit. The jet engine technology pioneered in aircraft like the Me-262 influenced post-war fighter development on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Research into aerodynamics, materials science, guidance systems all benefited from German wartime work that was preserved in underground facilities and captured by Allied intelligence teams. This raises uncomfortable questions that historians have grappled with for decades. Did the United States and Britain, by recruiting Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip, by exploiting research conducted through slave labor, By offering these men comfortable lives in America, rather than war crimes trials at Nuremberg, compromise their moral position as liberators fighting a just war against fascism? The answer is neither simple nor satisfying. Many of the Operation Paperclip recruits were indeed complicit in Nazi crimes. They had joined the party willingly, not under duress. They had worked in facilities where concentration camp prisoners died. They had accepted the regime's priorities and contributed their expertise to its goals. That their work ultimately advanced American and Allied security interests in the Cold War does not erase their earlier actions. But the historical context also matters. In 1945, the Grand Alliance that had defeated Hitler was already fracturing. The Soviet Union, which had borne the greatest burden of the European war with 27 million dead, was emerging as a potential adversary. American policymakers faced a stark calculation. German scientists and their knowledge would be exploited by someone. Better that someone be the United States than the Soviet Union. This logic was compelling in the moment, but it carried a cost. By shielding men like von Braun from accountability for their roles in slave labor operations, by sanitizing their records and presenting them to the American public as brilliant scientists rather than Nazi collaborators, the United States government created a mythology that distorted history. Von Braun became a celebrity in America during the 1950s and 60s, the face of the space program, appearing on television with Walt Disney to explain rocket science to children. His past was known to government officials, but carefully obscured from public view. It was not until investigative journalists began examining Operation Paperclip in the 1980s and 90s that the full extent of these scientists' Nazi connections became widely known. By then, most of them had lived out comfortable lives, acclaimed and honored, while the prisoners they had helped exploit remained largely forgotten. The underground cities themselves stand as monuments to a particular kind of madness, the totalitarian state's willingness to sacrifice everything, including the lives of its own people and those it had conquered, in pursuit of technological superiority. The tunnels at Nordhausen, at Ries, at Bergkristall represent the fusion of advanced engineering and systematic brutality. They show us what becomes possible when human life is assigned no value, when entire populations can be worked to death in service of the state's goals. Modern visitors walking through these preserved sections of tunnel often struggle to reconcile what they are seeing. The engineering is genuinely impressive. The scale of construction, the sophistication of the ventilation and electrical systems, the precision of the manufacturing facilities, all of this demonstrates extraordinary technical capability. But every meter of tunnel was carved at a cost measured in human suffering. Every rocket assembled represented not just a triumph of engineering, but a triumph of cruelty. The discovery of these underground facilities by American forces in April and May 1945 marked a turning point in modern warfare and intelligence gathering. It demonstrated that defeated enemies possessed knowledge and capabilities that could be exploited by the victors. It established precedents for how advanced technology would be secured and controlled in the post-war world, and it launched the United States and Soviet Union into a technological competition that would define the Cold War and ultimately lead to the space age. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in July 1969, he was carried there by a Saturn V rocket designed by Wernher von Braun, who had learned his trade building Wa-2 missiles with slave labor in tunnels beneath Kohnstein Mountain. The direct line connecting Mittelwerk to Tranquility Base is undeniable. So too is the moral complexity of that connection. Today, 80 years after American troops first entered those tunnels, the underground facilities built by Nazi Germany serve primarily as memorials and historical sites. They remind us of what happened there, of the prisoners who died in darkness, of the weapons produced at such terrible cost, and of the choices made by those who discovered these places. The Mittelbau Dora Memorial receives thousands of visitors each year, school groups and historians, veterans and families of victims. They walk through the same tunnels where V-2 rockets once stood in rows, where prisoners worked and died, where American soldiers made their shocking discovery in April 1945. The exhibits do not glorify the technology. They focus on the human cost, ensuring that those who died are remembered, that their suffering is not forgotten in admiration for the engineering achievements built on their graves. The Project Reese tunnels in Poland have become tourist attractions, but they too strive to educate visitors about the full context of their construction. Information boards detail the conditions prisoners endured, the death toll, the ultimate futility of the entire project. These are not celebrated as engineering marvels, though they are marvelous in scale. They are presented as warnings, as evidence of what can happen when technological ambition is decoupled from human morality. In Austria, the few remaining sections of Bergkristall that can still be accessed serve a similar purpose, preserving memory, honoring the dead, teaching future generations about the dangers of totalitarianism and the responsibility that comes with scientific knowledge. The American engineers and soldiers who discovered these underground cities in the spring of 1945 could not have fully grasped what they had found. They saw tunnels and rockets, factories and laboratories. They recognized the military value of what they were capturing. But the broader implications, the way these discoveries would shape post-war geopolitics, the moral questions that would haunt historians for decades, all of that lay in the future. What they understood immediately and viscerally was the human cost. The bodies stacked at Nordhausen, the survivors too weak to stand, the testimony of prisoners who had endured months or years in those tunnels, all of this made clear that they had uncovered something monstrous. The technology was impressive, but it had been purchased with systematic murder. That tension between technological achievement and moral horror, between scientific progress and human suffering, defines the legacy of Nazi Germany's underground cities. They represent a warning that echoes down through the decades. Advanced technology does not make a civilization great. Sophisticated engineering does not constitute moral progress. A society that can build wonders while committing atrocities has not advanced. It has simply made its barbarism more efficient. The tunnels remain, carved into mountains, preserved in sections, slowly being reclaimed by water and time where they have been abandoned. They are empty now, the machinery removed, the rockets gone, the prisoners departed. But they are not silent. They speak to anyone willing to listen, telling a story of what was discovered there in the spring of 1945, when American engineers walked into darkness and found both the future of warfare and a testament to human cruelty beyond measure. That story continues to matter. It reminds us that scientific knowledge carries responsibility, and that technological power must be tempered by moral wisdom, and that the cost of pursuing advancement without regard for human dignity is ultimately measured not in engineering specifications or production statistics, but in the countless lives destroyed in the process. The underground cities of Nazi Germany stand as monuments to that truth, preserved not to celebrate what was built there, but to ensure we never forget what it cost.